The morning Nora Calloway buried her husband, it rained so hard the cemetery turned to mud and swallowed the heels of her good shoes whole. She had to leave them there in the ground, 2 feet from the freshest grave in Harlan County, Kansas, and walk back to the car in her stocking feet, while her daughter held an umbrella over her head and her son-in-law stared at the middle distance the way men do when they don't know what to do with grief that isn't theirs. She didn't cry. Not then. She'd been doing her crying in the dark for 6 weeks, since the night the phone rang at 2 in the morning and the voice on the other end told her that Raymond had gone off the county road in his truck, that the creek had been running high from the storms, that they'd found him at daybreak caught in the willows downstream. She'd done all her crying by the time they put him in the ground. What she felt standing in that mud, in her stockings, watching the casket sink, was something older and quieter than grief. It was the particular silence of a woman who has just realized that the entire architecture of her life has been built around one person, and that person is gone, and now she is standing in the wreckage trying to figure out which walls were load-bearing. Raymond Calloway had been a wheat farmer for 31 years. He'd inherited the land from his father, worked it with his hands, and a stubbornness that people in Harlan County either admired or found deeply irritating, depending on how often they'd been on the receiving end of it. He'd loved Nora with the same stubborn permanence he brought to everything else. He wasn't a man who spoke about his feelings. He was a man who fixed the porch step before she could ask, who left the truck warmed up on cold mornings, who never once in 33 years of marriage forgot the date they met at the Grange Hall dance in November of 1989 when she was 22 and he was 26, and he'd stepped on her foot twice during a waltz and apologized so formally that she'd laughed for the first time all evening. She had married the apology as much as the man. She'd spent 33 years grateful for both. What Raymond had not done, what nobody had told Nora, or perhaps what everyone had assumed Raymond himself had told Nora, which he hadn't, because Raymond Calloway was a man who believed the rain would always come eventually and the prices would turn around eventually, and everything hard was temporary if you were stubborn enough about it. What Raymond had not done was keep the farm financially sound. The debts had been accumulating quietly for years, the way water gets into a foundation. You don't notice it until the floor buckles. The floor buckled 6 days after the funeral, when Raymond's accountant drove out from the county seat with a manila folder and an expression she'd seen on doctors' faces before they delivered bad news. That terrible practiced compassion that meant whatever came next was going to require you to sit down first. She sat down. The numbers in the folder were not complicated. They were simply very, very bad. The operating loan from the Farm Credit Bank was $218,000. The equipment loan on the combine was $47,000. The second mortgage Raymond had taken 2 years ago to cover a crop loss that insurance hadn't fully paid was $91,000. Against those numbers sat the farm itself, 640 acres of Kansas wheat ground that had been appraised 14 months ago at $1 million, which sounded like a lot until you subtracted the debts and the accountant's fees and the estate taxes and the interest that had been compounding while Raymond lay in the willows of Harlan Creek for 6 days before anyone found him. What would be left for her, after everything was settled, was approximately $180,000. Enough to buy a small house somewhere. Enough to live carefully for perhaps 6 or 7 years, if nothing went wrong, if she stayed healthy, if the world held still. She was 55 years old. The world had a habit of not holding still. Her daughter, Patricia, lived in Wichita with her husband Greg, who sold commercial insurance and coached youth soccer on weekends and was fundamentally a decent man in the way that fundamentally decent men sometimes are, well-meaning in broad strokes, uncomfortable with anything that required sustained emotional attention. Patricia had 2 children, ages 9 and 11. And a mortgage of her own and a life that had been carefully constructed to have exactly as much room in it as it had room for, which did not include a grieving mother with nowhere to go. Patricia said, of course, that Nora was welcome. She said it 3 times, in the way people say things 3 times when they are hoping the thing will become true through repetition. Nora heard the subtext under every repetition. She had been listening to subtext her whole life. She thanked her daughter and said she'd figure something out. She moved into the farmhouse's spare bedroom and started calling it a plan. The estate sale was Patricia's idea. Practical, efficient, Patricia-like. Everything that couldn't follow Nora into a smaller life had to go. The extra furniture, the tools, the decades of accumulated farm equipment, the outbuildings full of Raymond's organized and unjustifiable optimism about things that might someday be useful. Nora walked through the sale on a gray October Saturday and watched strangers carry pieces of her marriage away in their trucks. A man she didn't know paid $40 for the wooden rocker Raymond had sat in every evening after supper to watch the news. She watched it go into the back of a stranger's pickup and felt something shift behind her sternum that she couldn't name and didn't try to. Most things sold. Some things didn't. The auctioneer, a sunburned man named Dale Murchison who smelled of coffee and tobacco and had been running farm auctions in Harlan County for 22 years, came to find her at the end of the day with his clipboard and a look that suggested the news was mixed. The old grain bin didn't move, Mrs. Calloway. She'd almost forgotten about it. It sat at the back edge of the property, 100 yards past the last real outbuilding, half hidden by a stand of volunteer elms that had grown up around it over the years until the trees were wider than the bin itself. It was old. Raymond's father had built it in 1952 from corrugated galvanized steel, the kind of round steel bin that used to sit on every farm in Kansas before the age of commercial storage facilities. It held about 3,000 bushels of grain, theoretically, except that it hadn't held anything since at least the late 1980s, according to Raymond's memory, which had been reliable about most things. The floor had rusted through in one corner. The roof had a dent in it the size of a small car from some hailstorm decades past. The door had been welded shut at some point, for reasons that Raymond had never explained and that Nora had never thought to ask about, because there are always things in a marriage that you don't ask about because they seem too small to bother with at the time. Nobody bid on it. Nobody even walked over to look at it. Dale Murchison reviewed his clipboard with the professional neutrality of a man who had delivered all kinds of news to all kinds of farmers' widows. Nobody wants to haul that off, he said. Too much trouble. If you want it gone, you'll need to pay someone to take it apart and scrap the metal. That'll run you $200-300 probably. Nora looked at the number at the bottom of his tally sheet. The sale had brought in $14,200, which was $14,200 more than she'd had yesterday, and was also somehow not quite the same as a future. She drove out to the bin the next morning before the mist had burned off the fields. The elms had gone gold, and the bin sat inside them the way something abandoned always sits, not quite part of the landscape anymore, not quite separate from it either, just there, the way things are that nobody has decided what to do with yet. She walked around it twice. The corrugated steel had gone from silver to rust orange in patches. The bottom edge had heaved slightly where frost had pushed the soil over the decades. There was a bird's nest in the gap between the dented roof panel and the rim, empty now. Whatever had lived there long gone south. The welded door was solid, the weld bead dark and old and done by someone who knew what they were doing, which meant Raymond's father almost certainly, who had known how to do most things. She pressed her palm flat against the steel. It was cold, and it rang faintly under her hand, hollow and private, like the inside of a bell. She didn't know why she didn't have Dale Murchison arrange to have it scrapped. She couldn't have explained it if she'd tried. There are decisions that happen below the level of language, in some older part of the brain that knows things the thinking mind hasn't figured out yet. She walked back to her car and drove to the county seat and met with the estate attorney, a careful woman named Judith Hale who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had been sorting out the aftermaths of Harlan County lives for 28 years. Judith Hale reviewed the estate inventory. When she got to the grain bin, she paused with the particular pause of someone doing arithmetic. "This is technically personal property separate from the real estate," she said. "If you're taking it off the farm sale, you need to establish a value for estate purposes. What's it worth?" Judith Hale looked at the description. She looked at Nora. She wrote a number down on a notepad, tore the sheet off, and slid it across the desk with the expression of a woman who had learned not to apologize for facts. The number was $9. $9. Not 900. Not 9,000. $9. Because the scrap steel value of a deteriorated 60-year-old grain bin with a rusted floor and a dented roof, minus the cost of labor to dismantle it, minus the cost of hauling, came out to $9 if you were being generous and the scrap market was having a decent week. Nora Calloway looked at the number for a long moment. Then she wrote a check from the estate account for $9.50, 50 cents for the county recording fee, and she became the legal owner of one deteriorated grain bin. Personal property, fair market value $9, located on the back corner of a farm that was no longer hers. She drove home and did not tell Patricia. Patricia found out 3 days later, the way Patricia always found out about things, through a combination of her mother's unguarded expression and her own refusal to let unguarded expressions pass without investigation. They were sitting at the kitchen table of the farmhouse, which still felt like Nora's kitchen even though the papers had been signed and the farm was technically in the process of transferring to its new owners, a young couple from outside Dodge City who had made an offer at asking price and had been politely businesslike throughout, the way people are when they're getting something they want and don't want to jinx it. Patricia was making a list. Patricia made lists the way other people breathe constantly, automatically, the lists themselves a form of respiration that kept her functioning. This particular list was about the logistics of Nora's transition. The spare bedroom in Wichita, the storage unit for the furniture Nora was keeping, the timeline for the farm handover, the appointment with the financial planner Greg knew who could help Nora think about the $180,000 in a structured way. She looked up from the list and saw her mother's face. "What aren't you telling me?" Nora told her about the bin. The silence that followed had texture to it. It was the particular silence of a daughter who has been managing her mother's affairs with maximum efficiency and has just discovered that her mother has done something that does not fit anywhere in the spreadsheet. "Mom, it's still there," Nora said. "I just didn't have it scrapped." "You paid $9 for a rusted grain bin. $9.50 with the recording fee." Patricia set her pen down. This was significant. Patricia did not set her pen down. "What are you going to do with a grain bin? You're moving to Wichita. You don't have any property to put it on. You can't live in it. It can't hold grain. It has a hole in the floor. It's worth $9, and you paid $9 for it, which means you have spent your entire $9 budget on a thing that does nothing." "I know what it's worth," Nora said. "Do you?" "Because you have $180,000 and no income and no pension and you're 55 years old, and you're spending emotional energy on a worthless grain bin instead of planning for your future, and I don't understand why." Nora looked at her daughter across the kitchen table. Patricia had Raymond's jaw, that same stubbornness in the set of it, the same refusal to let a thing go once she decided it was important. She had Nora's eyes, though. Whatever was behind them was something Nora recognized from her own mirror. "Because it was his," Nora said. "Because your father welded that door shut and I never asked him why, and now I can't ask him, and I want to know." Patricia picked her pen back up. She looked at the list. She added a line at the bottom that Nora couldn't read from across the table. "It's scrap metal," she said. "Not a mystery." "Maybe," Nora said, "but it's mine." The news spread the way things spread in Harlan County, which was fast, inaccurate, and enthusiastic. By the end of that week, the story had passed through the grain elevator, the Farm Bureau office, the Methodist Church Fellowship Hall, and the counter at Dean's Hardware, which was where the shaping of public opinion in Harlan County had been happening for at least 40 years. The version people told was not unkind, exactly. People in Harlan County had generally been kind to Nora Calloway. Raymond had been well-liked and his death had been genuinely mourned. But kindness has limits when it comes up against the particular human pleasure of a story that confirms what people already believe about the fundamental impracticality of grief. What they said was, "Poor Nora." What they meant was, "Bless her heart, she's not thinking straight." Earl Dietrich said it at the grain elevator on a Thursday, loud enough for 3 people to hear and carry it further. "Raymond's gone 6 weeks, and she's keeping that junk bin. Paid good money for it." "Well, $9, but still. That's $9 she didn't have to spend on garbage." Marvella Hutchins at the Methodist Church said it more gently, which somehow made it worse. "She's holding on, is what she's doing. Can't let go of things that remind her of him. That bin probably means something to her. But meaning doesn't pay bills, does it? Poor thing." Greg, who was fundamentally decent and therefore felt terrible about what he was thinking, did not say anything. He only mentioned to Patricia, very quietly, that the financial planner thought Nora should be very careful about any impulsive decisions during the grief period, that grief could affect judgment, that this was a documented phenomenon, and Patricia said yes. "Greg, I know," and looked at the wall. The person who said it most directly was Carl Murchison, Dale's younger brother, who ran a salvage and scrap operation outside of town and who had estimated the bin's demolition cost in the first place. He stopped by the farmhouse on a Saturday under the pretext of returning a piece of equipment he'd borrowed from Raymond years ago and had finally remembered to bring back. He stood in the driveway turning his cap in his hands and said, "Mrs. Calloway, I just want you to know, if you change your mind about that bin, I'll take it off your hands for nothing. No charge. Because I know you've got enough to deal with, and I don't want that thing to be a worry to you." "It's not a worry," Nora said. "It's not worth anything," he said. "I mean no offense. I just want to be straight with you." "I know what it's worth," she said. "Same thing I paid for it." He left with the same expression Patricia wore sometimes. That particular combination of concern and bewilderment that people got when they couldn't decide if she was being brave or foolish. She had decided to stop trying to tell the difference herself. She had not yet told anyone what she planned to do, partly because she hadn't fully decided, partly because whatever she had decided existed only in that deep, wordless place below language, and translating it upward into something she could say out loud would require it to become defensible, and she wasn't sure it was defensible. She only knew that the $9 bin on the back of what used to be her farm sat in its ring of volunteer elms like something that had been waiting for her specifically, and that the welded door and the rusted floor and the dented roof were not the whole story, and that somewhere in the marriage she'd spent 33 years inside, there was a thread she hadn't followed to the end. She found the first clue the way you find most important things, by not looking for it. She was packing the last of Raymond's desk items, the physical archaeology of a man's working life, pencil stubs and auction catalogs, and seed company calendars going back to 2011, and rubber bands dried to brittleness, and a coffee cup that said "World's Okayest Farmer" that his granddaughter had given him 3 Christmases ago. Under all of it, in the bottom drawer, beneath a phone book from 2008 and a farmer's almanac from the same year, she found a manila envelope that had been sealed with several layers of tape, the tape yellowed and stiff with age. Her name was on it. Raymond's handwriting. Nora. That was all. She sat down in his chair, which still smelled faintly of him, of motor oil and the peppermints he carried in his shirt pocket, and she held the envelope for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The paper was old but not ancient, cream-colored, written in Raymond's careful block printing, which he'd used for anything he considered important because his cursive, as he'd always said himself, looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. The letter was undated. It might have been written recently. It might have been written 10 years ago. There was no way to know. "Nora, if you're reading this, it means something happened, and I didn't get the chance to tell you what I should have told you a long time ago. I'm sorry for that. There are things I kept from you because I didn't know how to explain them without explaining everything, and everything was too big to start. My father built that bin in 1952. You know that. What you don't know is why he welded the door in 1963, which was the year his partner in the stone business came to collect what he said my father owed him. And my father told him there was nothing to collect, and the man left, and my father went out that same night and welded the door on the bin and never spoke of it again. I never opened it. I thought about it many times. I never opened it because my father said not to, and because there are some things you leave alone if you're smart, and I was mostly smart about most things. But I'm not smart enough to know what's in there, and I should have been. Whatever it is, it's yours now. You'll know what to do with it. You always knew what to do with things I didn't. I loved you from the minute you laughed at my apology for stepping on your foot. I want you to know that." Raymond, she read it twice. Then she folded it back along its creases and put it in her coat pocket, and went and sat on the porch in the October cold and watched the fields that were no longer hers go amber in the afternoon light. Raymond's father. A stone business. A partner. 1963. She was a careful woman. She had been a farm wife for 33 years, which meant she had learned to think in systems, in seasons, in consequences that cascaded from single decisions. She thought now in the same careful way. Raymond's father, whose name was Walter Calloway, had died in 1978, 20 years before Nora came into the family. She had known him only through Raymond's stories and the photographs in the front room. A stocky man with Raymond's jaw and an expression that suggested he found most of life's comedy slightly irritating. Walter had farmed his father's ground and added to it, and left it in reasonable order for Raymond. That was the family story. That was all Nora had ever known of him. A stone business. She turned that over in her mind the way you turn over a stone itself, looking for what lives beneath. She went inside and opened the laptop Patricia had helped her set up, in which she was still navigating with the careful precision of someone who has learned to drive later in life functional. but nothing was yet automatic. She typed Walter Calloway, Harlan County, Kansas, 1963 into the search bar and pressed enter and waited to see what the world remembered. Not much, it turned out. Local. Newspaper archives from that era were sparse. The Harlan County Courier had been digitized only back to 1975. She found a reference to Walter Calloway in a 1968 agricultural census, a reference to his land holdings. She found his obituary from 1978, which was 2 paragraphs long, and said he was survived by his son Raymond and had been a faithful member of the First Lutheran Church and had farmed in Harlan County his whole life. It did not mention a stone business. She searched again. Walter Calloway, Kansas diamond. She didn't know why she typed that word. It arrived from somewhere below language, from the same place the decision about the bin had come from. The result that came back made her hand go still on the touchpad. It was a digitized page from a geological survey publication, dated 1961. The Kansas Geological Survey Bulletin, Volume 152. A dense academic document about mineral exploration in the Central Great Plains. She skimmed it with the growing attention of someone who has stumbled onto a path in the dark and isn't sure yet where it leads. Kansas, the survey noted with the measured understatement of academic writing, sits on the eastern edge of a geological structure called the Mid-Continent Rift System. The rift, which formed approximately 1 billion years ago, had created conditions along certain ancient fault lines that were geologically consistent with the formation of kimberlite, the volcanic rock that is the primary source of diamonds worldwide. The survey documented 14 sites across Kansas and Nebraska where kimberlite indicator minerals garnet, ilmenite, chromite had been found in stream sediment samples. It named several private landowners who had cooperated with the survey. One of the names in the acknowledgement section, thanked for access to a sample site in Harlan County, was Walter R. Calloway. Nora sat back from the laptop. She sat there for a long time. Then she got up, put her coat on, and drove out to the bin. She stood in front of the welded door in the last of the afternoon light and pressed her palm flat against it the way she had before, and this time the hollow ring of it sounded less like emptiness and more like something held. The weld bead was dark iron, smooth, continuous, run by someone who had not wanted this door opened again in a casual way. You would need a grinder to get through it, or a cutting torch. She had neither. She walked around the bin again, looking this time with different eyes. The corrugated panels ran from ground to eave in vertical ribs, bolted together at the seams. Standard construction for the era. The dented roof panel was at the north side. The rusted floor hole was at the southwest. A gap perhaps 8 inches across where the galvanized steel had finally given way to the slow chemistry of moisture and time. She crouched down and looked through the gap into the interior. Dark. She couldn't see anything. She pulled out her phone and switched on the flashlight and angled it through the gap. The floor of the bin was what she'd expected. Corrugated steel, heavily rusted, covered in a layer of old chaff and dirt and mouse nesting material that had accumulated through decades of small animal habitation. The walls were the same corrugated panels from the inside, bolted at the seams. Standard. Ordinary. A grain bin. Except, she moved the flashlight slowly, methodically, the way she'd learned to look at things when Raymond was having trouble with equipment, and she was the one doing the visual inspection while he stood behind her and directed. Slow and systematic, panel by panel. The walls. The eave. The floor. There. At the center of the bin floor, directly below where the roof peak would be, there was a seam that didn't belong. The floor panels of a grain bin from this era ran in concentric rings from the outer wall toward the center, like the rings of a tree. But at the center, where the innermost ring should have met itself and stopped, there was instead a deliberate line, straight and clean, cutting across the arc of the natural seam. A rectangle, perhaps 3 feet by 4 feet, cut with intention and care and then covered, she could see now, with a layer of old concrete that had been feathered at the edges to blend with the surrounding rust and dirt. Someone had put a false floor in this grain bin. Nora Calloway sat back on her heels in the Kansas dusk and looked at the rusted gap in the floor of a $9 bin and understood that Raymond had been right about one thing. She knew what to do with things he didn't. She drove back to the farmhouse. She did not call Patricia. She did not call the accountant or the attorney or the financial planner Greg knew. She sat at the kitchen table with Raymond's letter in front of her, and she thought about Walter Calloway and a stone business in 1963 and a door welded shut that same year, and a geological survey that put kimberlite indicators in Harlan County soil, and a rectangular seam under the center of a grain bin that had sat behind an elm thicket for 62 years while the world moved on around it and didn't look. She made one call. She made it at 9 o'clock in the evening, which was perhaps not the most polite hour, but she had decided that some things required not waiting. The man who answered had been Raymond's friend before he was anyone else in Nora's life. His name was Thomas Okafor. He was 61 years old, a geology professor at Kansas State University who had grown up 3 farms over from the Calloway place and had stayed in Raymond's orbit his whole life despite the distance that education and career had put between their daily lives. He had been at the funeral. He had been one of the people who carried the casket. He had held Nora's elbow when the mud took her shoes and had not said anything, which was exactly right. "Thomas," she said when he answered, "I need to ask you something about kimberlite." There was a pause. Not the pause of someone calculating what to say. The pause of someone whose interest has been engaged so completely that they need a moment to calibrate their voice before speaking. "Nora," he said, "where are you right now?" "Sitting at Raymond's desk." "Don't go anywhere. I'm going to make some calls tonight and come out there tomorrow morning, and I want you to show me something. And then I'm going to tell you everything I know about kimberlite in Harlan County, which is quite a lot, and most of it will change how you understand what is on that property." "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, and his voice was careful with the specific care of a scientist who has learned that precision matters most when the facts are large. "I mean that your father-in-law's name is in papers I have read. I have read them many times. And I have driven past that bin many times over the years, and Raymond would never let me stop and look. And now I think I understand why." Thomas arrived at 7:15 the next morning with 2 colleagues she hadn't met before. One was a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who was perhaps 40, compact and efficient in the way of someone who spends a great deal of time in the field and has learned that everything unnecessary is weight. She carried an equipment case that was treated with the same care one gives to instruments that break before they can be replaced. The other was a younger man named Carter Wells, a graduate student who seemed to vibrate with contained excitement in the way that young people do when they can tell something important is happening, but haven't yet learned to disguise their anticipation. They stood in the kitchen, and Thomas put his hands around a mug of coffee and told her what he knew. Walter Calloway, he said, had been approached in 1960 by a geologist named Hendrik Voss, who worked independently and who had been quietly surveying the central Kansas fault system for 3 years. Voss believed, based on indicator mineral analysis from the creek sediments that ran through several farms, including the Calloway land, that there was a kimberlite pipe of volcanic intrusion, the kind that brings diamonds up from the mantle within a half-mile of the Calloway farmstead. He had approached Walter about a partnership, exploration rights, mineral development, a share of whatever was found. Walter had agreed. They had worked together for 3 years. In 1963, Thomas continued, Hendrik Voss came to Walter Calloway with something he had found. The nature of what he found is not fully clear from the published record, because the published record at that point goes silent. What is clear is that shortly after this meeting, Hendrik Voss left Kansas and did not return. He died in Cape Town, South Africa, in 1989. He had spent the years between leaving Kansas and dying in Cape Town working in various capacities in the diamond trade, which was documented in South African industry records that Thomas had spent a sabbatical year tracing. What Voss found, Thomas said, and what he may or may not have given to Walter Calloway, and what Walter may or may not have kept. That part of the story was a blank that had bothered Thomas for 12 years, ever since he'd first encountered the Voss files in the Kansas Geological Survey archive. He looked at Nora over his coffee mug. What did you find? She told him about the rectangular seam. She showed him the photograph she'd taken on her phone, the flashlight-lit image of the false floor's edge, barely visible through the rust gap, but there, clear enough once you knew to look. Thomas set down his coffee. He looked at Priya Anand. She looked at Carter Wells. Carter Wells looked at the photograph with his lower lip caught between his teeth and his eyes very bright. We need to get into that bin, Priya said. Her voice was completely level. The level of a woman who has learned to be calm in front of evidence that is making everything inside her run fast. I know, Nora said. That's why you're here. The cutting torch Carl Murchison had used on other things over the years came with Carl himself, who had received a call from Thomas that morning and who arrived at the bin site an hour later with the kind of equipment and the kind of expression of a man who has just been told that the thing he tried to persuade a widow to give up for free might be worth reconsidering. He did not say anything about his previous offer. Nora did not mention it either. There are certain conversational silences that function as perfect understanding, and this was one of them. Carl Murchison cut through Raymond's father's weld bead in 11 minutes. The cutting arc traced the seam with a precision that would have satisfied Walter Calloway, who had done the original weld with similar care. When the last inch gave way, the door released with a sound like a long-held breath, metal shifting against metal, and a smell came out that was 62 years of interior air dry, dark, carrying the ghost of old grain and the metal-cold scent of enclosed space. The group stood in the October morning outside the open door. Nora went in first. She went in first because it was hers, because the $9 was hers, because the letter was hers, because Raymond had written "You'll know what to do with it," and she had driven out here in the dark and looked through a rust hole in the floor with a phone flashlight and found a seam that nobody had been looking for, and she was not going to stand outside the door while someone else went in first. The interior was dim, the light from the door reaching only partway. Carter Wells handed her a proper flashlight, a long aluminum one with a grip. She switched it on and moved it slowly around the space. The walls, the eave bolts, the floor. At the center, the concrete patch was clearly visible now from inside, the feathered edges visible where it met the rusted original floor. It was perhaps an inch thick, she judged, applied over whatever was below with the care of someone who expected it to last and did not expect to be watched while doing it. The workmanship was Walter Calloway's. She could see that in the care of it, the same care as the weld on the door, the same care as everything on the farm that Walter Calloway had built and that Raymond had maintained. Dr. Priya Anand came in beside her. She crouched at the edge of the concrete patch and put on nitrile gloves and took a small instrument from her case and began working at the edge of the patch with the focused attention of a woman doing something she has trained for and waited for and thought about and not let herself fully believe until this moment. Nora stood and watched. Outside, she could hear Thomas talking quietly to Carter Wells, their voices low and contained. She could hear the October wind moving through the elm trees. She could hear her own breathing, which was slower than she'd expected, steadier, as if some part of her had already arrived at a place of knowing and was simply waiting for her eyes to catch up. Priya worked for 20 minutes. The concrete patch came up in 3 sections, each one lifted carefully and set aside. Below it was a steel plate, fitted flush to the original floor, bolted at 4 corners with bolts so heavily corroded they looked like they had grown there. Priya looked at them and looked at Nora, and Nora went to the door and told Carl Murchison what she needed. Carl came in with a breaker bar. The first bolt came after significant effort. The second came more easily. The third required the kind of language Carl apologized for afterward, and Nora waved off. The fourth came free, and the plate shifted, and Carl and Carter Wells together lifted it up and set it against the wall. Below was a space. The space was lined with concrete on all 4 sides and was approximately 4 feet deep. Walter Calloway had dug it by hand, she realized, through the original bin floor, through the subsoil, lining it with concrete that he had mixed and poured in what must have been a night of extraordinary and solitary labor. Whatever he had been given, or had found, or had kept, he had decided it needed to be kept very carefully and very privately, and for a long time. Nora leaned over the edge of the space, and Priya held the flashlight. Inside were cases, metal cases, the kind used for instrument transport or document storage, gunmetal gray, sealed with rubber gaskets designed to keep the interior environment stable. There were 7 of them, stacked in 2 layers. The cases were stamped on their lids in letters she couldn't immediately read from this angle. But as Priya adjusted the light, the words came clear. The words were in Dutch. Priya Anand made a sound that was not a word. It was a short, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes people before professional composure can stop it. "Nora," she said, and her voice had changed. She said it the way you say someone's name when you need them to be very steady because you are about to tell them something that will require steadiness. "What is it?" Priya looked at her. Her eyes were very bright in the flashlight glow. "Those cases," she said, "are De Beers transit protocol cases. I have seen photographs of them in industry literature. They are used for the secure transport of rough diamond parcels from mine sites to sorting facilities. They were manufactured between 1940 and 1975, after which De Beers moved to a different system. Nora looked at the 7 cases in Walter Calloway's hidden concrete vault. She looked at them for a long time. How many diamonds fit in a case like that? She asked. Priya Anand answered her carefully. Nora put her hand on the bin wall to steady herself. Outside, the October light was coming through the open door in a long rectangle across the rusted floor, and the elm trees were moving in the wind, and somewhere in the distance a tractor was running on somebody else's fields. She could hear all of it with great clarity. She could hear her own heartbeat. She thought about Raymond, who had kept a secret from her for 33 years because he hadn't known how to explain everything, and because some things were too big to start. She thought about the $9. She thought about Patricia's list on the kitchen table, the one with the line at the bottom she hadn't been able to read. She straightened up from the wall of the bin and looked at Priya Anand and Thomas Okafor, who had come in quietly and was standing at the back of the space with the expression of a man confronting 12 years of academic wondering made suddenly physical and real. We need an attorney, Nora said, and we need someone from a certified geological laboratory. And we need to do this correctly from the beginning, because whatever is in those cases, it belongs to whoever it belongs to under the law, and I want to know that before anything else. Thomas looked at her with the expression people wore when they were surprised by someone who was not surprised by themselves. You're not going to open them? Not until I know the right way to open them, she said. I've waited this long. I can wait a little longer. She walked out of the grain bin into the October morning. Carl Murchison was standing by his truck looking at a spot in the middle distance that suggested he was doing arithmetic he hadn't expected to be doing today. She walked past him to the edge of the elm thicket and stood in the dappled light under the golden leaves and put her hand in her coat pocket where Raymond's letter was folded. You'll know what to do with it. You always knew what to do with things I didn't. She did. She always had. The question now was what it was going to mean. What those 7 cases contained, what they were worth, what rights applied, what history they carried in their sealed gunmetal interiors. That was the next part. That was the part that would require patience and procedure and the kind of careful, systematic attention she had been paying to things her whole life, only now on a scale she had not previously imagined. She stood under the elms and looked at the bare Kansas sky, and somewhere in the distance the tractor kept running on someone else's land, and the wind moved through the trees, and the $9 bin stood open behind her with its 60-tier secret finally breathing outside air for the first time. She took the letter out of her pocket and held it in both hands, not reading it, just holding it. The paper was warm from her body heat. I loved you from the minute you laughed at my apology for stepping on your foot. I know, she said quietly, to nobody, to Raymond, to the sky. I know you did. She put the letter away and went back to work. The attorney Judith Hale recommended was named Marcus Briggs, and he drove out from Wichita in a car that suggested he was doing well enough not to need to impress anyone, which Nora took as a good sign. He was 63, black, with reading glasses he wore on top of his head like a man who keeps forgetting he put them there, and he had spent the last 20 years of his career in mineral rights law, which in Kansas was its own distinct subspecialty, a country within a country, with its own customs and its own history and its own particular capacity for making ordinary people's lives extraordinarily complicated. Judith Hale had not said he was the best. She had said he was the right one. Nora had learned to trust that distinction. He arrived the morning after the bin was opened, which had been the morning after Nora's call to Thomas, which meant that everything was happening in a compressed sequence that felt both inevitable and slightly vertiginous, like a key turning in a lock that has been frozen shut for decades and suddenly gives all at once. Marcus Briggs walked around the outside of the bin twice without speaking. He went inside and looked at the concrete vault and the 7 cases still sitting in it, undisturbed, exactly as they'd been left. He looked at the De Beers transit stamps on the lids. He looked at Priya Anand's preliminary notes, which she had written in a precise hand on 3 pages of yellow legal paper, and which said, in the specific vocabulary of a geologist who had spent her career around kimberlite and the things it carried, that what they appeared to be looking at was a collection of rough diamond parcels consistent with South African alluvial and kimberlite source production from the mid-20th century, and that a certified gemological assessment would be required. before any figures could be responsibly discussed, but that her preliminary visual estimate based on the case sizes and the transit protocol standards she was familiar with suggested a quantity that would require her to sit down before she finished the sentence. Marcus Briggs read all 3 pages. He flipped back and read the first page again. He took his reading glasses down from the top of his head and put them on and read the second page one more time. Then he looked at Nora with the expression of a man who has been in mineral rights law for 20 years and thought he had seen most of what the earth could produce to complicate a human life. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "tell me everything, from the beginning. Leave nothing out." She did. She told him about Raymond's letter, about Walter Calloway and Hendrik Voss, about the geological survey, about the weld on the door and the concrete patch, and the rectangular seam she'd found with a phone flashlight through a rust hole in the floor. She told it in order, calmly, with the same systematic attention she'd brought to it from the beginning. Marcus Briggs took notes in a spiral notebook using a pen he uncapped and recapped at intervals, and when she finished he sat for a moment without writing anything. "The first question," he said, "is ownership. That's always the first question, and it's the only question that matters before any other question gets asked. Mineral rights in Kansas follow a particular legal history. The land sold to its new owners, but personal property located on that land at the time of sale is a different matter, and you took title to this bin as personal property before the land transfer completed. That part is solid. Good. The second question is provenance. These cases carry De Beers markings. De Beers doesn't lose track of its inventory casually. If these stones came through De Beers channels, there is going to be a chain of custody that someone is going to want to reconstruct. That process will either support your claim or complicate it, and I can't tell you which until we know more about how Hendrik Voss came to have them in 1963. She nodded. She had already thought about this. "The third question," Marcus Briggs said, and he put his pen down for this one and looked at her directly, "is who else knows." She told him, Thomas Okafor, Priya Anand, Carter Wells, Carl Murchison. He looked at the ceiling briefly. For people in addition to herself. For people who had not yet spoken publicly. For people who would need to maintain that silence for long enough to establish the legal framework before the story got out. "How fast can a secret travel in Harlan County?" he asked. She thought about Earl Dietrich at the grain elevator and Marvella Hutchins at the Methodist Church. She thought about how the news of the $9 bin had made its way through every conversation in town in 72 hours. "Fast," she said. "Then we moved today," Marcus Briggs said, and he uncapped his pen. The first call he made was to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's Heritage Crime Unit, which was not a call Nora had anticipated. She sat across from him at Raymond's desk while he explained the situation with the efficient precision of a man who has trained himself to convey the essential without the ornamental, and she watched the expression on his face as he listened to the response, and she read in that expression the thing she had already suspected, that the Bureau knew the name Hendrik Voss. He hung up and looked at her. "They have a file," he said. "It's old. From 1988. Someone reported a suspected connection between a Harlan County property and unregistered diamond inventory from the mid-1960s. The report was unsubstantiated at the time and was never acted on. It was filed and remained filed for 36 years. Who reported it?" He wrote a name on his notepad and turned it toward her. She looked at the name. She read it twice. The name was Raymond Calloway. She sat with that for a long time after Marcus Briggs left. She sat at Raymond's desk in the quiet of the farmhouse, the October light moving across the floor the way it always had, the way it would continue to move long after she had finished with this desk and this chair and this house that was no longer hers. Raymond had known. Not everything his letter made clear that he didn't know what was in the cases, that Walter had never told him specifically, but he had known enough. He had known that something was there and that it was not straightforwardly his, and he had reported it to the state authorities in 1988, and they had done nothing, and he had made the decision that Walter had made before him, to leave the door welded shut and the secret buried and the question unanswered. Not because he was dishonest. She knew that with the same certainty she knew the sound of his truck coming up the lane. Raymond Calloway was one of the most fundamentally honest men she had ever known. He was honest the way the land was honest, with a directness that didn't distinguish between comfortable truths and uncomfortable ones. He had left it alone because he hadn't known what the right thing to do was, and Raymond, in her experience, only acted when he was sure. When he wasn't sure, he waited. He had been waiting since 1988, and he had run out of time to finish waiting. And so he had written her the letter and left her the problem and trusted her to know what to do. She felt the grief of that particular trust settle into her bones in a new way. Not the acute grief of the first weeks, the one that ambushed her in the cereal aisle and the quiet after supper. This was a different shape of grief. The grief of understanding a person more completely after they were gone than you had while they were here. The grief of all the conversations that didn't happen because the time always seemed sufficient and then wasn't. She pressed her hands flat on the desk where his hands had been, and she let herself feel it fully, because she had learned in 55 years that the things you don't let yourself feel fully accumulate and cause damage later, and she didn't have time for damage. Then she stood up and called Patricia. Patricia arrived that evening from Wichita in the focused, purposeful way she traveled when she had been told something that required her presence and had not been told enough to know what to do about it yet. She came in the front door and looked at her mother with the reading the room expression she had developed over years of managing things, and she sat down at the kitchen table and she listened. Nora told her everything. She told it in the same order she'd told Marcus Briggs. From the estate sale to the letter to the geological survey to the false floor to the 7 cases to the De Beers stamps to Raymond's 1988 report to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. She did not omit anything. She did not soften anything. She told it as fact, which it was, and she watched her daughter's face move through a sequence of expressions that she recognized. The controlled skepticism that was Patricia's default, the crack in that control when the geological survey came up, the further crack at the De Beers stamps, and then the final expression, which was something Nora hadn't seen on her daughter's face in a long time, and which she recognized after a moment as the expression of someone who has just understood that the foundation of a calculation they've been relying on was wrong. When Nora finished, Patricia sat for a moment. Then she said, "Dad knew. He knew something was there. He didn't know what. But he tried to do something about it. In 1988. Yes." Patricia looked at the table. She looked at the list she'd been making, which was still there from the day before, with its careful columns and its line at the bottom Nora couldn't read. She reached out and turned it face down. "I said it was scrap metal," she said. "You couldn't have known. I told you it wasn't worth anything." I said. Nora reached across the table and put her hand on her daughter's hand. "You were trying to protect me," she said. "That's what you do. That's what you've been doing since your father died. You make lists and you build structures around things so they can't hurt people, and that is a good thing to do, and I love you for it. But you couldn't have known what was in that bin. Neither could I. Neither could Raymond. We were all working with the same information, and the information we had pointed toward nothing." Patricia looked at her mother's hand on hers. She turned her hand over and held on. "What happens now? Now we do it carefully," Nora said. "And we do it right. Because that's the only way it holds." The geological assessment team arrived 4 days later. Marcus Briggs had arranged it through channels that moved faster than Nora had expected, which told her something about how seriously he was treating this, and how seriously the people he called had responded. The team came from the Gemological Institute of America's Midwest office, 3 people, led by a senior gemologist named Dr. Lena Faber, who was 54 and had spent her career handling stones that had complicated histories, which in the diamond trade meant almost all of them. She had the specific composure of someone who has learned that expressing emotion about what you find in a case is a luxury the job doesn't allow, and she wore it so thoroughly that it had become simply who she was. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation sent an agent named Dwight Moreno, who was 47 and had been in the Heritage Crime Unit for 11 years, and who treated the bin site with the careful non-expression of someone professionally trained to not let crime scenes know they're interesting. He documented everything in photographs and notes before Lena Faber's team opened anything. He logged the serial numbers on the cases. He logged the precise condition of the vault below the false floor. He was thorough and unhurried, and Nora approved of him on both counts. Patricia had taken a week of personal leave. She stood at the edge of the group, holding a coffee she kept forgetting to drink, watching everything with the attention she usually directed at spreadsheets. Carter Wells had returned from K-State with Thomas, who had spent the intervening days pulling every piece of academic literature he could find on Hendrik Voss and kimberlite exploration in central Kansas, and who had arrived with a folder so thick it required its own bag. The first case was opened at 9:17 in the morning. Lena Faber unsealed the rubber gasket with instruments designed for the purpose, handling the lid with both hands, lifting it in a smooth single motion that suggested she had done this many times with many cases and had learned not to anticipate what she found. She set the lid aside. She looked into the case. She looked for 3 full seconds without speaking, which in Nora's reading of her was approximately 3 times longer than her professional composure usually allowed. Inside was a tray system, 6 trays deep, each tray divided into compartments lined with white fabric. In each compartment was a paper parcel, folded in the traditional diamond trade manner, a fold-out envelope of translucent paper that kept stones contained while allowing visual inspection without handling. The parcels were labeled in handwriting that would later be identified as Hendrik Voss's a date, a weight in carats, a notation in the abbreviated shorthand of the sorting room. Lena Faber opened one parcel. She set the contents on the portable examination surface her team had established. She turned on the loop light. She looked. She looked for a long time. Then she did something Nora suspected was not standard protocol. She looked up from the loop and found Nora in the small group and said, directly and without preamble, "These are exceptional stones." "How exceptional?" Thomas asked, because he could not stop himself. Lena Faber looked at him with the expression of someone returning from a considerable distance. "I will need several days to assess all 7 cases," she said. "I cannot give you figures before I have done the work properly. But I can tell you that the first parcel I've opened contains 31 stones, ranging from 4 carats to approximately 18 carats, that appear to be of high clarity and color. The preliminary identification is consistent with South African production, likely Kimberley or Finch pipe material, based on the crystal morphology. These are not industrial-grade stones. They are not near-gem material. They are gem-quality rough, and the larger specimens, if they cut the way I expect from preliminary inspection, would produce finished stones of significant commercial value." "How significant?" Patricia said. Lena Faber looked at the parcel in front of her, at the 31 stones on the white examination surface, each one catching the portable lamplight and doing specific and unrepeatable things with it. She named a range per stone for the top 3 specimens she could see. Patricia's coffee cup tilted in her hand, and Thomas caught it before it hit the ground. "And there are," Nora said steadily, "how many parcels total?" Lena Faber looked at the first case, its 6 trays, its compartments. She looked at the 6 cases still sealed in the vault. "I don't know yet," she said. "That is what the next several days will tell us." On the second day of assessment, the Voss family arrived. Not Hendrik Voss, who had been dead since 1989. His daughter. Her name was Elspeth Voss Brouwer. She was 68 years old, and she had flown from Cape Town to Johannesburg to London to Chicago to Wichita, which was not a route that suggested spontaneity. She had a South African attorney with her named Adrian Kellerman who wore a suit that had crossed 4 time zones without wrinkling, which told Nora something about either the suit or the man, and she wasn't sure which. Elspeth Voss Brouwer was a tall woman, angular, with her father's eyes. If Nora had to guess, she had seen a photograph of Hendrik Voss in Thomas's files, a man with the watchful precision of someone accustomed to judging value in small things. And she walked into the farmhouse kitchen with the particular self-possession of someone who has prepared herself for a confrontation and is determined to conduct it at a pitch that does not betray how much she needs the outcome. She said, sitting down across from Nora at the kitchen table where Nora had signed the $9 check, and where she had read Raymond's letter, and where she had watched Patricia turn her list face down and surrender something. She said, "Those stones were my father's." Nora looked at her. "They were your father's," she agreed carefully. "In 1963. What happened to them between 1963 and now is what we need to understand." "My father was cheated," Elspeth Voss Brouwer said. "He found the kimberlite indicators on this land. He did the work. He brought the stones here for safekeeping during the assessment period, because he did not trust the arrangements he had in the city, and because Walter Calloway was his partner. And then Walter Calloway locked the door, and my father left, and the stones never came back to him." Nora heard this. She heard the anger in it, and she heard the grief under the anger, which was the same grief she was carrying herself, the grief of someone who lost something important when they couldn't get an explanation in time. She did not dismiss it, but she also did not accept it at face value, because she had been thinking carefully about what Walter Calloway was and what he was not, and the man who had welded that door and kept that secret for the rest of his life, was not a thief. She knew it the way she knew Raymond's honesty. It ran in the blood. "Do you have documentation of the partnership agreement?" Marcus Briggs asked. He had been sitting quietly to Nora's left, which was where he always positioned himself, close enough to be present, far enough to be unobtrusive until he needed to be neither. Adrian Kellerman opened a briefcase. He produced a document in a protective sleeve. A handwritten agreement, 2 pages, in English and Dutch. 2 signatures at the bottom, Hendrik Voss and Walter R. Calloway. Dated September 14, 1960. Marcus Briggs examined it without touching the sleeve. "This establishes a partnership," he said. "It does not establish ownership of specific stones. And it does not explain why the stones were sealed in a vault under a grain bin rather than being in the possession of either partner or both partners." "My father wrote about it," Elspeth said. "He kept a journal. In 1963 he wrote that Walter Calloway had told him the stones were not safe to move, that there was a man coming to collect a debt, that they needed to stay hidden until the situation resolved. My father believed him. My father came back 3 months later and Walter told him the stones were gone, that they had been taken by the man who came to collect the debt." "He lied to your father," Patricia said. It wasn't a question. She had been sitting against the wall with her face doing the quiet arithmetic it did when she was working something out, and she had arrived somewhere. "If he lied," Nora said, and she felt something sharpen in her, not quite anger, not quite grief, something that required precision rather than emotion. "Then the question is why. And the question of why is something we can answer if we look at what we have." She looked at Marcus Briggs. "Raymond's 1988 report," she said. Marcus Briggs opened his own folder. In 1988, he said to the room, Raymond Calloway filed an anonymous report with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation indicating that a property in Harlan County might contain unregistered diamond inventory associated with a 1960s mineral exploration operation. The report named Hendrik Voss. It said the inventory had been placed in concealment by the original landowner for reasons that the reporting party believed were connected to a debt dispute rather than criminal intent, and that the reporting party did not know the current disposition of the inventory and could not access it without breaking into sealed structures that might be needed as evidence. Elspeth Voss Brower looked at the table. Something moved across her face that was not the controlled anger she had arrived with. "Raymond knew," Thomas said quietly, from his corner of the room. "Raymond knew enough," Nora said. "He knew his father had kept something that wasn't entirely his to keep. He knew Hendrik Voss had come looking and been told the stones were gone. He filed a report because he thought the authorities should know, and the authorities did nothing, and Raymond was left with a door he couldn't open and a truth he couldn't finish. He wrote me a letter instead. The letter," Marcus Briggs said, "is relevant to your claim, Mrs. Calloway. It establishes that the current title holder had prior knowledge of the contested property and took legal action in the 1988 report rather than concealing it. That's favorable." Elspeth looked at Nora. Nora looked back at her. The two women looked at each other across the table for a moment that held more than the people in the room perhaps noticed. They were the same age within 3 years. They had both been carrying something that started with a man they loved and a secret that man kept and a door that stayed closed longer than it should have. "I don't believe your father stole them," Nora said. "I think your father hid them here in good faith, and my father-in-law kept them when he should have returned them. And I think the reason he kept them may have had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with the man who came to collect the debt. But I don't know, and I would like to know." Elspeth looked at her for a long moment. "So would I," she said. "I have wanted to know my whole life. The man who came to collect the debt in 1963 took Thomas 6 days to identify, and he found the connection the way academic research usually works at its best, not through a dramatic discovery, but through the slow accumulation of adjacent facts until the picture resolves from its own details. His name had been Cilliers Brandt. He was not a man who appeared in newspaper archives or public records in any obvious way, because men like Cilliers Brandt in the 1960s diamond trade were not men who appeared in obvious places. He appeared in the margins, in shipping manifests where his name showed up as a consignment broker, in 2 court documents from South Africa, both civil, both settled before judgment, in a 1961 letter that Hendrik Voss had written to a colleague in Antwerp, a letter preserved in that colleague's papers and now held by a Belgian university archive, in which Voss referred to a man pressuring him for a commission on the Kansas stones that was not agreed upon and that he did not intend to pay. Silliers Brandt, Thomas had concluded from the aggregate of these references, was the kind of man who moved around the edges of the legitimate diamond trade in the way water moves around obstacles, not confronting directly, but finding every available path, and patient about it. He had pressed Voss for a percentage of whatever the Kansas operation produced. Voss had refused. Brandt had apparently then turned his attention to the partner, Walter Calloway, who had the physical custody of the stones and who was a Kansas wheat farmer facing a debt he couldn't pay, which made him precisely the kind of leverage point a man like Brandt would recognize and apply. What Thomas believed had happened, what the documents, taken together, suggested, was that Brandt had come to Walter Calloway in 1963 with a proposition that was not quite a threat and not quite an offer, but occupied the space where those two things become indistinguishable. Pay the debt, or let me take the stones. Walter had had a third option, which was to tell Hendrik Voss that the stones were gone and weld the door shut and wait for Brandt to conclude there was nothing to collect and leave, which Brandt apparently had, which meant that Walter Calloway had not stolen from Hendrik Voss out of greed. He had hidden the stones from a man who would have taken them by force, and then he had not found a way to tell Voss the truth. And then he had died in 1978 with the door still welded and the problem still buried. And it had passed to Raymond, who had filed his report and his conscience away in the same drawer and waited for the right moment. And the right moment had never come, and then Raymond was gone too. And it was October, and Nora's shoes were in the mud of the Harlan County cemetery, and she was standing in her stockings figuring out which walls were load-bearing. She told this to Elspeth Voss Brouwer on the 6th day, in the farmhouse kitchen, with Thomas's research spread across the table between them like a map of everything that had gone wrong before either of them was old enough to ask the right questions. Elspeth was quiet for a long time. He was protecting them, she said. Your father-in-law. From Brandt. That's what Thomas believes. That's what the documents suggest. And then he couldn't find a way to tell my father. Or was afraid to. Or didn't know how. Or thought the right moment would come, and it didn't. Elspeth pressed her lips together. Nora watched the anger and the grief work against each other behind the woman's eyes. The same battle she'd been watching in her own mirror for 2 months. My father died thinking Walter Calloway betrayed him, Elspeth said. He spent 26 years after leaving Kansas believing he'd been cheated by his partner. It affected everything. His work. She paused. His capacity for trust. He became very cautious. Very isolated. Nora heard this. She let it sit without filling the space around it. I'm sorry, she said. I cannot fix what that cost him. I wish I could. Elspeth looked at the research on the table. At Hendrik Voss's name in Thomas's documents. At the letter to the Antwerp colleague. A photocopy of a photocopy. The words faded but legible. What are you proposing? She asked. I'm not proposing anything yet, Nora said. I'm waiting for Lena Faber to finish her assessment. And then I'm going to propose something that is fair. Not legally required. Fair. Because what happened between our fathers was not fair, and I can't undo that, but I can try to settle the account properly. Elspeth Voss Brouwer looked at Nora Calloway across the table. She picked up the Antwerp letter photocopy and read it again, and Nora watched something in her face gradually stop fighting and begin instead to consider the possibility that the person across the table was not an adversary. Lena Faber's full assessment took 9 days. On the 9th day, she came to the farmhouse with her team and her documentation and a summary report that was 31 pages long and that she had prefaced, when she called to say it was ready, with the words, I want you to sit down before I bring this over. Nora had said she was already sitting. Lena Faber had said, sit somewhere comfortable. The report covered 7 cases. 112 individual parcels. 4,308 rough stones in total, ranging in weight from half a carat to a single exceptional specimen of 44.7 carats that had caused Carter Wells, when it was first extracted from its parcel on day 4, to make a sound that Thomas described later as the sound a person makes when the inside of their chest expands faster than the outside can accommodate. The breakdown was methodical. Lena Faber went through it section by section, her voice carrying the specific flatness of someone reading aloud from a document they have prepared precisely in order to be read aloud from, so that no inaccuracy could creep in through paraphrase. Overall quality assessment, predominantly gem quality. 73% of stones by count fell into the upper 3 quality classifications used by the GIA for rough material. The remaining 27% were near gem or commercial grade. Provenance assessment, consistent with South African production, likely a combination of Kimberley region and Orange River alluvial material, based on crystal form, inclusions, and trace element signature. The transit cases bore De Beers infrastructure markings consistent with their sorting office protocols from the late 1950s through mid-1960s. However, and this was the part Lena Faber paused before reading the De Beers records for this specific inventory batch, accessed through a formal request that the GIA had made on Nora's behalf, indicated that the consignment had been logged as a private sale in 1962 to an independent broker. The buyer was listed as H. Voss, Harlan County, Kansas, USA. The room was completely quiet. They were sold to him, Marcus Briggs said. Legitimately. Lena Faber nodded. The De Beers records indicate a completed private treaty sale. Hendrik Voss purchased this inventory through proper channels. He paid for it. It was his. The chain of title runs from De Beers to Hendrik Voss in 1962, and from that point it has been she looked at the 7 cases, and at the vault, and at the concrete patch, and at the rust, and the elms, and the 62 years of Kansas weather outside the window dormant. Which means, Patricia said, and her voice was doing something Nora hadn't heard in it before, something cracked and wondering, like a person who has been looking at a situation from the wrong angle and has just rotated it. Which means the ownership question, Marcus Briggs said slowly, is complex. Elspeth Voss Brower was at the table. She had been at every meeting for the last 5 days. She said nothing. She held very still. De Beers sold to Voss. Marcus Briggs continued, working through it aloud. Voss brought the stones to Kansas and deposited them with his partner for safekeeping. Voss's intention was clearly to reclaim them. He came back for them. Walter Calloway told him they were gone, which was false. Walter Calloway then maintained physical possession of the stones until his death in 1978. Raymond Calloway inherited physical possession but took no action to claim legal title. Nora Calloway acquired the bin as personal property in a legal estate transaction and discovered the stones. He looked at his notepad. There are 2 plausible ownership claims. He looked at Elspeth. As Hendrik Voss's heir, you have a claim based on the original purchase and the fact that the stones were never voluntarily surrendered. He looked at Nora. As the current title holder of the physical property through a legal purchase, you have a claim based on possession and the doctrine of treasure trove under Kansas law. The treasure trove doctrine in this state awards recovered property to the finder when the original owner cannot be determined. In this case, however, the original owner's heir is present and has documentation, which complicates that doctrine's application significantly. He put his pen down. The honest answer, he said, is that this will take time to resolve through the courts if you let it go to the courts. That process could take years. It will cost both of you significantly. And at the end of it, a judge will decide based on precedent that doesn't perfectly fit either of your situations, and neither of you will be fully satisfied. He looked at both of them. Alternatively, he said, you could resolve it between yourselves. With attorneys. With proper documentation. Outside the court. And you could do it in a way that reflects what actually happened, rather than what the law can most efficiently process. Nora looked at Elspeth. Elspeth looked at Nora. What is the total assessed value? Nora asked Lena Faber. Lena Faber looked at the last page of her 31-page report. She had been building to this since she arrived. Since the first day, since the first parcel, since she had looked into the first case and taken 3 full seconds to compose herself before speaking. Rough value at current market rates, she said, based on projected cut yields and current wholesale pricing for finished goods of this quality profile, accounting for the full distribution of grades across all 7 cases. Her voice was level, the level of long practice. Falls in the range of $290 million to $320 million. She looked up from the page. The 44.7-carat specimen alone, she said, if it cuts as I expect, may represent 20 to 30 million of that figure as a single stone. Patricia's chair scraped back from the table. She did not leave the room. She simply needed to put slightly more space between herself and what she'd just heard, the way you take a step back from something very bright. Carter Wells had gone completely white. Thomas Okafor had his hands folded on the table in front of him and was looking at them with the expression of a man in prayer or something adjacent to it. Nora sat perfectly still. She sat the way she had sat in the mud of the cemetery in her stockings, in the silence after things collapse. She sat with it. 308 million, she said eventually, splitting the range in the way she always rounded things in her mind, toward the middle, toward the practical. In that range, Lena Faber confirmed. The $9 bin, Patricia said, from across the room. Her voice sounded like someone speaking through a window. The $9 bin, Nora agreed. The proposal she made to Elspeth Voss Brouwer was not legally required. Marcus Briggs had made that clear. He had laid out the legal landscape with the care of a man who respects his client's autonomy and does not substitute his judgment for hers, but who also wants her to be fully informed before she makes decisions of this magnitude. The treasure trove doctrine, the chain of title, the dormancy of Voss's claim across 62 years. There were arguments to be made, real ones, that Nora could press for the full recovery, that she could litigate and likely prevail on significant portions of the claim. She did not want to do that, not because she didn't need the money. She needed the money. She was 55 years old with $180,000 and no income and a future that required construction from materials she didn't yet have. She understood what $300 million meant, and she was not pretending it didn't mean that. But she also understood what the letter in her coat pocket meant. She understood what Walter Calloway had done, which was to protect stones that belonged to someone else and then fail to return them. And she understood that Raymond's report in 1988 had been a man trying to do right by a wrong his father had let become permanent. She had 33 years of that man's honesty in her body, in the way she moved through the world, in the standards she held herself to without conscious effort, the way you hold yourself to the standards of people you've loved long enough. She made the proposal in the kitchen at Raymond's table. Marcus Briggs and Adrian Kellerman took notes. Thomas was present because Nora wanted a witness who was not her attorney. Patricia was present because she was Patricia and because she had turned her list face down 4 days ago and had been watching her mother with the expression of someone who was revising a fundamental understanding of a person they thought they already knew completely. The proposal was this. The stones would be liquidated through a process managed jointly by their attorneys and overseen by the GI, which would ensure maximum value realization and proper documentation. The proceeds, after taxes and legal fees applicable to each party, would be divided. 60% to Nora Calloway, as finder and legal title holder, and as the person whose husband had tried to bring the situation to legal resolution in 1988. 40% to Elspeth Voss Brouwer, as the heir of the original purchaser and the person who had spent 60 years without this inheritance her father had intended. The 44.7-carat stone was to be excluded from the general liquidation and offered to Elspeth at cost, which in practical terms meant it was a gift, because the cost was the assessed rough value before cutting, and the finished value would be 3 to 4 times that. And Nora knew it, and Elspeth knew it, and Nora made the offer anyway. Because Hendrik Voss had found it. Because he had bought it and carried it to Kansas and trusted his partner with it. Because it had been his. And it was the largest and most exceptional thing in the vault, and it should go back to his family, and that was not a legal calculation, it was a human one. Elspeth looked at her for a long time. Adrian Kellerman leaned over and said something in her ear. She made a small gesture that clearly meant she had heard him but was not changing her mind. Why? She said to Nora. You don't have to do this. The treasure trove, because my husband tried to do the right thing, Nora said, and I am finishing it for him. Because your father brought those stones here in good faith and was told a lie and spent the rest of his life believing the lie. And because, she paused, and the pause was not for effect, it was because she was finding the right words and would not use wrong ones. Because what I have been given is more than money. I have been given a reason. I have been given something that happened because I paid $9 for a bin that everyone told me was worthless, and that means something to me that is separate from what it means financially. And I do not want to hold what is mine at the cost of what is yours. Patricia made a sound. It was very small, and she covered it immediately with the hand that wasn't holding her coffee, but Nora heard it. Elspeth Voss Brouwer sat with the proposal for 2 full minutes. No one spoke. Outside, the wind had come up in the elms, and the October sky was doing its late day darkening, the blue going deep and cold. The farmhouse kitchen smelled of the coffee Patricia had made and the old paper smell that was Raymond's office blending into the space, and the specific quality of silence that descends when a decision of real weight is being weighed. Elspeth said, yes. And then, after another moment, she said, My father would have been glad to know it was kept safe. He always said Walter Calloway was a good man. He said that even after, he couldn't hold on to it fully because of what he believed had happened, but it was the thing he came back to sometimes. That he must have been a good man, because he had seemed like one. He was, Nora said. His son was. I can tell you that with certainty. Elspeth nodded. She straightened in her chair. Then I think, she said, we should call our attorneys in properly and write this down correctly, and then perhaps someone should make more coffee. Patricia was already at the counter. The news broke on a Wednesday, 11 days after Lena Faber's assessment. Not through a press release, not through a deliberate announcement. Through Carl Murchison, who was a man who could maintain a secret under normal pressure, but who could not maintain one in the presence of his brother Dale at the Dairy Queen in town on a Tuesday evening, which was the wrong combination of factors in the wrong place at the wrong time. And by Wednesday morning, it had made the journey from Dale to the grain elevator to the Methodist Church to Dean's Hardware at a speed that would have impressed anyone studying information transmission in small, closed systems. By Wednesday afternoon, it was on the Wichita television news. By Thursday, it was national. The version that spread was not exactly wrong, but it was compressed and simplified, and it lost its texture in the compression, the way things do. What remained was the outline. Widow of a Harlan County wheat farmer buys abandoned grain bin for $9 at estate sale. Bin contains 7 cases of diamonds worth approximately $300 million. Cases hidden since 1963. This outline, stripped of Walter and Hendrick and Raymond's report, and Silleter's brand, and the Antwerp letter, and the 44.7-carat stone, and what it meant to give it back, this outline was enough to generate the specific kind of public reaction that Nora had anticipated and Marcus Briggs had warned her about, and which arrived now in full. First came the reporters. They parked on the county road in front of what had been her farm and waited. They were persistent, and most of them were polite, and 2 of them were neither, and Marcus Briggs issued a statement that was measured and said what it needed to say and nothing that it didn't. Nora did not speak to them. Not yet. She was not ready to give the story to people who would need to simplify it, and she did not want to simplify it. Second came the people who believed they had a claim. There were more of these than she'd expected, and the range of their creativity was genuinely impressive. A man from Oklahoma City who said he was a descendant of a Harlan County settler and believed the land had mineral rights that had never been properly transferred. A woman in Denver who said her grandmother had worked for Hendrick Voss and was owed wages from 1963. A man who mailed a 3-page letter handwritten in green ink claiming that the kimberlite formation under the Calloway land was part of a larger geological feature that overlapped with his family's Oklahoma property, and he was owed a share of the diamonds on the basis of underground mineral continuity, which was not a legal theory that Marcus Briggs could find any precedent for in any jurisdiction. Marcus Briggs handled these. Nora focused on other things. Third, and this was the one she had not anticipated in its specific form, came Earl Dietrich. Earl Dietrich appeared at the farmhouse on a Thursday morning with a dish of cookies his wife had made, which was the specific currency of Harlan County social navigation. And he stood on the porch with the cookies and an expression that moved between its component parts, the bluster he'd had at the grain elevator and something underneath the bluster that was harder to identify. She let him in because she had always been a woman who let people in, because the alternative required a hardness she didn't have and didn't want. He sat at the kitchen table where everyone sat eventually, and he said, "Mrs. Calloway, I want to say something." She waited. "I said things. After Raymond died. About you in the bin. I said you weren't thinking straight." She waited. "I was wrong," he said. "And I'm sorry." The words came out stiff, the way words come out when someone has practiced them in the car on the way over and is relieved to have gotten through them without rearranging the order. Nora looked at him. Earl Dietrich had known Raymond for 40 years. He had been at the funeral. He had genuine affection for Raymond, which expressed itself in the only way he knew how, which was through opinion and commentary and the specific Harlan County way of caring about people by monitoring them closely and reporting publicly on their failures. "Thank you, Earl," she said. "I know you meant well." He nodded, slightly too quickly, the relief visible. "I didn't know," he said, "about what was in there." "Nobody did," she said. "That's the point." He left the cookies and she ate one standing at the counter and thought about the long distance between knowing and understanding and how most of the journey in between was just time. The liquation process, as Marcus Briggs had called it, was not fast. It was not supposed to be fast. Diamonds of this quality and quantity and provenance required the involvement of established trade channels, proper documentation, patient negotiation with buyers who operated in a world where $300 million changed hands quietly, and with paperwork that had to be correct because the consequences of incorrect paperwork in this market were not the kind that could be easily undone. Marcus Briggs worked with Adrian Kellerman and a specialist trade attorney in Antwerp named Klaus Vermeer, who had been recommended by the GIA, and who communicated primarily by encrypted email at hours that reflected the Brussels time zone rather than the Kansas one. Lena Faber's team remained engaged for the authentication certifications that would accompany each parcel through the liquidation process. The GIA issued formal certificates that created the documented chain of title from the De Beers original sale through to the current moment. Nora spent the waiting time the way she'd always spent difficult waiting time, working. She had taken a part-time position at the Harlan County Extension Office, helping farm families navigate the paperwork for federal agricultural programs, which was work she understood instinctively from 33 years of being a farm wife, and which paid $18 an hour, and which kept her structured and useful and in contact with people who were navigating the same hard, ordinary problems she'd been navigating herself 2 months ago. Patricia called every day. The calls had changed in texture since the farmhouse table. They were less structured. Patricia had stopped making lists during them, or at least she'd stopped mentioning them, which might have been the same thing or might have been a genuine change, and Nora didn't press to find out which. One day Patricia said, "I looked it up. The treasure trove law. What Marcus Briggs said about what you could have argued. I know what it said. You could have argued for all of it. I know. But you gave 40% to Elspeth. Yes. Because of Dad. Because of your grandfather. Because of Hendrik Voss. Because of what happened when people kept things that weren't straightforwardly theirs and couldn't find the way to fix it. Because I have been given the chance to fix something that 3 men before me didn't fix, and that is worth more to me than the percentage difference." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I put a new list on the table," she said. "After everything. When I got home from that last day at the farmhouse." Nora smiled at the phone. "What did it say?" "Just one thing." Patricia's voice was doing the thing again, the cracked and wondering thing, and this time she didn't cover it. It said, "Mom is braver than I knew." On a gray November morning, 5 weeks after the grain bin was opened, the first sale closed. A single parcel 11 stones. The top 3 by weight from the first case was purchased by a Belgian dealer with established GIA certifications and a reputation for placing exceptional rough with cutters who could realize its full potential. The sale figure was in the documentation Nora signed, and she read it twice and folded the document and put it in the drawer of Raymond's desk and drove out to the bin. Carl Murchison had sealed the bin again, at Nora's request, with a new door fitted properly with hinges and a lock, because the site was now technically active evidence in a completed legal proceeding and because Nora had decided the bin was staying. Not because she needed it to store anything. Because it was hers. Because it had been $9 and it had become something she did not have a word for yet, but that was larger than value and smaller than everything. She stood outside the door in the November cold and put her hand against the steel. It rang under her palm. The same hollow note as before, except that now she knew what the hollow contained, or had contained the weight of 2 men's trust and 1 man's failure and another man's silence, and 62 years of Kansas weather pressing down on gunmetal cases full of light. She thought about Patricia's list. One item. "Mom is braver than I knew." She thought about Raymond's letter in her coat pocket, which was still there, which she had carried every day since she read it. She touched it through the fabric. "I'm finishing it," she said quietly, the way she had said "I know" in the cemetery. Not to the air, not to herself. To him. To the version of him that lived in the letter and in the oak rocker in a stranger's truck and in the porch step he had fixed without being asked, and in the truck he had warmed on cold mornings, and in all the ways a person who is gone stays present in the shape of the world they move through. "I'm finishing what you started in 1988, and I think you knew I would." The wind came through the elms, and the bin stood solid on its old foundation in its ring of golden trees, and the sky was the gray of November saying what November always says, which is that things end and things change, and the earth below the frost line stays the same temperature regardless, steady and constant and warm in the way that only things that don't move can be. She walked back to her car. She had work to do. The final sale closed on a Tuesday in February, which was an ordinary Tuesday in every external way: cold, gray, the kind of flat Kansas winter light that makes the world look like it has been photocopied one too many times and lost some definition in the process. Nora was at the extension office when Marcus Briggs called. She was helping a farm couple from the south end of the county fill out an emergency loan application. A young couple in their early 30s with the particular exhaustion of people who have been fighting the same financial current for 2 seasons running and are starting to wonder if the current is stronger than they are. She recognized the exhaustion the way you recognize a language you grew up speaking. She told Marcus she would call him back in 20 minutes. She finished the application. She made sure the couple had the fax number and the deadline and the name of the person at the farm credit office who had been most helpful to other families in similar situations. She walked them to the door and shook their hands and told them, with the directness of someone who has learned that false comfort does more damage than honest uncertainty, that she thought it would work out, and that she meant it. Then she went into the small conference room at the back of the extension office, which had a round table and 4 chairs and a whiteboard with the remnants of a presentation about cover crops still visible in one corner, and she sat down and called Marcus Briggs back. He told her the final figure. She sat with it for a moment. She had known it was coming. She had watched the sales proceed through November and December and January, had signed the documentation as each parcel moved through the process, had seen the numbers accumulate in the estate account with the growing unreality of figures that don't match the scale of any life you have previously lived. She had known the approximate total for weeks. But hearing it spoken aloud, in Marcus Briggs' careful, measured voice, in the back room of the Harlan County Extension Office on an ordinary gray Tuesday, that was different from knowing it. That was the moment a thing becomes real in the body rather than only in the mind. Her after-tax share, after legal fees and the GI documentation costs, and the Antwerp trade attorney, and everything else that had to be paid before anything else could be counted, was $161 million. Elspeth Voss Brower's share, after the same deductions on her side, was $107 million. The 44.7-carat stone, which had been purchased from Elspeth at the rough value price by a private collector in Geneva who had been introduced to the stone through Klaas Vermeer in Antwerp, had ultimately cut into a finished gem of 31.2 carats, pear-shaped, internally flawless, D-color, which was the highest color-grade a diamond could receive, which meant it was the color of nothing, which meant it was the color of pure light, which meant it had sold at auction in Geneva for $28 million and was now on a chain around a neck that Elspeth would never see and Nora had decided to be glad about in the abstract and not think about too carefully in the specific. Elspeth had wept when Klaas Vermeer told her the cut result. Not because of the money, she had said in the email she sent Nora afterward, though the money was not nothing. Because her father had found it. Because Hendrik Voss had picked that specific stone out of a river gravel in 1961 or 1962 and known what it was, and carried it to Kansas and trusted it to a man he believed was his friend, and now it had become what he always knew it could become, and he would never know that, and Elspeth would spend the rest of her life being glad that it happened and sad that he missed it, and she had accepted that this was how it was going to be, and that acceptance was its own kind of grace. Nora understood that completely. She understood it in her own bones. She sat in the extension office conference room for perhaps 10 minutes after she hung up the phone, and she looked at the whiteboard with its cover crop diagrams, and she thought about Raymond. She thought about the $9 and the letter and the weld bead and the 1988 report that nobody had acted on, and the 33 years of a marriage built around a man who fixed the porch step and warmed the truck and stepped on her foot at a dance in November and apologized so formally that she laughed. She thought about Patricia's list with its one item. She thought about the young couple with the emergency loan application and their particular brand of exhaustion that she recognized from the inside. Then she stood up, went back to her desk, and began making the call she had been planning to make since November. The first call was to Patricia. Patricia picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting, which meant she had known today was the day because she had been tracking the timeline with the same precision she brought to everything. "It's done," Nora said. Patricia said, "How much?" Nora told her. The silence on Patricia's end lasted 7 seconds. Nora counted. Then Patricia said, in a voice that was doing the cracked and wondering thing it had been doing more often recently, the thing she no longer covered, "Mom, I know. $161 million. I know. From a $9 bin. From a $9 bin. Another silence. Shorter this time. What are you going to do? I'm going to tell you, Nora said, and she heard Patricia breathe in and settle, the way Patricia settled when she was preparing to listen instead of to plan, which was a thing she had been learning to do and which Nora appreciated without saying so directly, because some things between mothers and daughters communicate better through behavior than through words. Nora had made her list. Not Patricia's kind of list, not the column and deadline kind. The logistical architecture that Patricia built around uncertainty to keep it contained. Nora's list was different. It was the kind of list you make when you have been given something you didn't earn and didn't expect and can't fully justify keeping all of, and you have been thinking for 3 months about what it means to receive something like that and what the receiving obligates you to. She had written it in the same cream-colored paper as Raymond's letter. She had written it in Raymond's block printing, because she had spent 33 years absorbing the way he formed his letters, and they had become partly hers. She read it to Patricia. The Walter and Raymond Calloway Farm Preservation Fund. $15 million, placed with the Kansas Farm Bureau Foundation, designated for emergency operating assistance to family farms in Harlan County and the surrounding 4 counties facing acute financial crisis, the kind of crisis where a single bad season or a single medical bill or a single piece of equipment failure becomes the difference between continuing and not. The kind of crisis the young couple had walked into the extension office with that morning. The kind of crisis Nora had watched approach her own life from close range and understood in its specific texture. The fund was structured to move fast. No 6-month review committees, no elaborate application processes. A single farm counselor with authority to release emergency assistance within 72 hours of application. Because Nora had learned, in 33 years of farming life and 2 months of financial freefall, that the gap between solvable and unsolvable in a farm crisis was often measured in days, not months, and that systems which moved slowly were systems that arrived after the damage was permanent. She named it for both of them. For Walter, who had made a mistake he couldn't correct, and had protected something imperfectly, and had kept his silence until the silence became the same as a lie. And for Raymond, who had tried to correct it and hadn't known how and had trusted her to finish it. Both of them deserved to be part of what came from what they'd kept. Patricia was quiet when Nora finished describing it. Then she said, "How much did you keep for yourself?" "Enough," Nora said. "That's not a number. 60 million. The rest goes to other things." Patricia made a sound that was not quite a word. It held the compressed weight of a daughter who has spent her entire adult life worrying about her mother's financial security and has just been told that her mother has given away roughly 60% of a $161 million inheritance. "Mom," she said. I'm 55 years old," Nora said. "I have $60 million. I have my health. I have a part-time job I like. I have a daughter who makes lists and a son-in-law who coaches soccer and 2 grandchildren who are 9 and 11 and will need college eventually. $60 million is more than enough for all of that." And the rest of it, she paused. Not for effect, because she was finding the words that were exactly right, not approximately right. "The rest of it was never really mine," she said. "It was Walter's and Hendricks and Raymond's, and it sat in that bin for 62 years waiting for someone to figure out what to do with it. I figured out what to do with it. That's all." Patricia was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality it had been developing over the past several weeks, the quality that was different from the list-making voice, less armored, more present, the voice of a woman who was in the process of revising something fundamental about how she moved through the world and had not quite finished the revision but was committed to it. She said, "Can I be on the board of the farm fund?" Nora smiled at the window of the extension office, where the gray February light was doing its flat, ordinary work on the Kansas landscape. "I was hoping you would ask that," she said. The second thing on Nora's list was the Voss Calloway Mineral Heritage Archive. Thomas Okafor had suggested it, in the careful way Thomas suggested things that he had already thought through completely and was pretending to introduce as a tentative idea in order to give the other person room to feel like a participant in the decision. He had been doing this since they were children on adjacent farms, and she had never called him on it because the ideas were always good. The archive would be housed at Kansas State University's geology department, in a dedicated room that would hold everything. Hendrik Voss's original survey materials, the geological records that had led him to Harlan County in 1960, The De Beers provenance documentation for the diamond inventory, Walter Calloway's handwritten agreement with Voss, the letters and journals that Thomas had spent a sabbatical year collecting from Belgian university archives and Cape Town record offices. All of it, documented and preserved and accessible to researchers. And one more thing, a display case, in the center of the room, containing two items. The first was the concrete patch that had covered the vault in the grain bin floor, removed in one piece by Dr. Priya Anand's team on the first day and kept in careful storage ever since. The second was the $9 check. Judith Hale had made a copy of the check before it cleared, on some professional instinct she hadn't been able to explain at the time. She had called Nora in January to ask if she wanted it back. Nora had asked if she could have the original. Judith Hale had said she would look into it, and she had. And the bank had been surprisingly cooperative once the full context of the situation was explained, which Nora suspected had something to do with the fact that the story was national news by then, and the bank's communications department had decided that being the bank that held the $9 check for the $300 million bin discovery was worth a certain amount of institutional goodwill. The check sat in Nora's kitchen drawer. She had looked at it several times in the weeks since she'd gotten it back. It was an ordinary check, cream-colored, the kind that came in a box of 200 from the bank, with the printed routing number along the bottom and her signature in the bottom right corner and the amount in her handwriting in the center, $9.51. The memo line read, grain bin. She would give it to the archive. Not because it was historically significant, though it was. Because it was the exact document that represented the distance between what a thing appears to be worth and what it actually is, and that distance was the whole story, and the story deserved to live somewhere that people could come and see it and think about what they had dismissed lately, what they had walked past, what they had decided was worth $9 when they hadn't looked closely enough. Thomas had wept a little when she described the archive to him. He had tried to conceal it in the way men of his generation tried to conceal things that moved them, by adjusting his glasses and looking at his notes and speaking slightly too carefully. Nora had let him have the privacy of the concealment. Some kindnesses work best when they are not acknowledged. The third thing was the one she had thought about longest. She had thought about it in the cemetery mud. She had thought about it in the car on the way out to the bin the first time, and the second time, and the morning she stood in the open doorway with the flashlight and understood what she was looking at. She had thought about it through all of Marcus Briggs's careful explanations and Lena Faber's 31 pages and the Geneva auction and the February Tuesday when the final figure arrived. She had thought about what it meant to be a woman who had spent 33 years as Raymond Calloway's wife and who had found herself at 55 in stockings in the mud with nothing but $180,000 and a letter in a manila envelope that said you'll know what to do. She had thought about the young couple that morning with their emergency loan application. She had thought about the farm couple she'd helped last month, and the month before, and the month before that. She had thought about the specific texture of the exhaustion she recognized in those faces, because she had felt it herself, and because before she had felt it herself, she had not fully understood it. And understanding a thing from the inside is different in kind from understanding it from the outside, no matter how much intelligence or empathy you bring to the outside view. The third thing was a program, not a fund. A program, because funds dispersed money and programs changed conditions, and what she wanted to change was conditions. She called it the Nora Calloway Transitions Program, which was a name she had not arrived at easily, and which Patricia had initially suggested should be named for Raymond or Walter or someone with more obvious historical connection to the story, and which Nora had insisted on keeping for herself because she had decided that a woman who gives away $100 million gets to name one thing for herself, and this was the one thing. And Patricia had laughed and agreed. The program was for farm families in transition, the specific moment when a farm was being sold or inherited or reorganized or ended, and the people inside that transition were trying to navigate a system that had been designed for people with lawyers and accountants and financial planners on retainer. The program provided exactly those things. A team of advisors who understood agricultural estate law and farm credit, and the particular way grief and finance become entangled when the asset being transferred is also the place where someone's entire life was built. The thing Nora had been at the extension office. The thing Judith Hale had been when she slid that notepad across the desk with the number that said $9. The thing Raymond should have had in 1988 when he was trying to figure out what to do about a secret that was bigger than he knew how to handle alone. The program would begin in Kansas and expand, if the model worked, to the other Farm Belt states where the same transitions happened in the same isolation, year after year, farm after farm, generation after generation. She funded it with $20 million. She appointed Patricia to the inaugural board, which Patricia accepted in the carefully contained way she accepted things that moved her too much to accept simply. She appointed Thomas Okafor as the academic advisor, which Thomas accepted by saying that he thought it was the most important work he could imagine being involved in, and then adjusting his glasses, and then looking at his notes. She appointed Elspeth Voss Brouwer as an honorary board member, which was a gesture rather than a functional role, a way of saying that what had happened between their families was not finished by the legal settlement, but had become the beginning of something rather than the end, which was how Nora preferred to think about most endings. Elspeth had accepted by email, in 3 sentences. The third sentence said, "My father came to Kansas looking for something valuable. He found the diamonds, but what he left behind was more valuable. Thank you for showing me that." Nora had read that sentence several times. She had thought about what Hendrik Voss had left behind, which was not the diamonds. Those had come from the earth, from the geology, from the billion-year-old violence of the rift, but the trust. He had left his trust in a grain bin in Harlan County, and it had sat there for 62 years, and it had finally come back to his family through a stranger who decided that fair mattered more than legal. That was worth more than 30 diamonds of exceptional clarity. She was sure of it. The story, by the time it was fully told, had the shape that good stories always have, which is not the shape of a line from bad to good, from nothing to everything, but the shape of something more complicated. A shape that required you to hold several things at once: the loss and the discovery, the dishonesty and the loyalty, the silence and the truth that the silence was protecting, the $9 and the $161 million. The documentary interest came quickly, as it always does when something spectacular attaches itself to something human. 3 production companies called Marcus Briggs in the first 2 weeks after the story broke nationally. Nora declined all of them, not because she was opposed to the story being told, but because she was opposed to the story being simplified, and she had not yet met anyone from a production company who was primarily interested in complexity. The book interest came more slowly and more seriously. A writer named Carolyn Marsh, who had spent her career writing about land and memory and the specific American experience of inheriting places that were also debts, drove out from Lawrence in March and sat at the kitchen table, the same table, always the same table. That table had become the center of gravity of the whole story, and she spent 4 hours listening and 2 hours asking careful questions that revealed she had already done a great deal of thinking about what the questions should be. Nora liked her. She liked the questions more than the credentials. She liked that Carolyn Marsh, when she looked at the $9 check that Nora brought out from the kitchen drawer, held it with both hands, and was quiet for a long moment before she said anything. And what she said was not about the money. What she said was, "He must have been a remarkable man." And she meant Raymond, not Hendrik Voss, not Walter, just Raymond, who had found his father's secret and tried in his imperfect way to do the right thing and had run out of time. Yes, Nora said. He was. She agreed to the book. She stipulated only 2 things: that Elspeth Voss Brouwer would have full input on the sections covering Hendrik Voss, and that the $9 check would appear on the cover. Carolyn Marsh agreed to both without hesitation. Elspeth came back to Kansas in April. She came alone this time, without Adrian Kellerman, without the protective formality of attorneys and claims, and the specific posture of someone prepared for a fight. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a rental car and knocked on the farmhouse door, which was still technically accessible to Nora through an arrangement with the new owners, who had turned out to be people with genuine warmth and genuine interest in the history of the land they'd bought, and who had, when the full story emerged, reached out through their realtor to say that Nora was welcome to visit whenever she wanted, that they understood this place was more than a property transaction. She and Elspeth drove out to the bin together. It was April in Kansas, which meant the elms had gone green again, and the fields surrounding the bin were showing the first color of the season, the specific green of wheat in early growth that Raymond had loved and pointed to every spring with the same quiet pleasure he took in things that worked the way they were supposed to. The bin stood in its ring of trees in the afternoon light, its new door fitted and solid, the corrugated panels still rusted but no longer empty, or rather, still empty in the obvious sense, still containing nothing but air and old chaff and mouse nest remnants, but no longer carrying that particular quality of things that hold secrets. The secret was done. The bin was just a bin now, $9 worth of corrugated steel and memories. They stood in front of it the way Nora had stood in front of it many times. She put her hand on the steel. It rang under her palm, hollow and familiar. My father built things, Elspeth said. That was how he was. He was always building something or planning to build something. He built a house in Cape Town from the ground up, himself, with help from a man he employed. He always said that a thing you've built is the only thing you can be sure of. He would have built something with the diamonds if he'd had them. Yes, he would have built. She considered what he would have built. I think he would have built a school. He was very particular about education. He thought most of the world's problems came from people not being properly educated about what was underneath things. Nora smiled at that. Underneath things. It was a good way to put it. Your father, she said. Did he ever come back to Kansas? After 1963? Elspeth shook her head. No. He talked about it sometimes. He said he would come back someday and find the truth. He said it for years, and then he stopped saying it, and then he died. He stopped believing there was a truth to find, I think. He decided Walter Calloway had simply taken what was his, and that the world was that kind of place, and he would accommodate himself to living in that kind of world. And now? And now he knows differently. Wherever he is. Elspeth looked at the bin, at the elms, at the April green of the fields. He was right that it was worth going back to. He was wrong that it would never happen. Nora thought about the 44.7-carat stone, now 31.2, now on a chain in Geneva, now the color of pure light. He found it, Nora said. He found the most exceptional thing in that vault. That belongs to him, wherever he is. Elspeth's mouth moved for a moment without producing words. Then she steadied. What will you do with this? She asked, gesturing at the bin. Will you keep it? I've bought it back, Nora said. The new owners sold it to me when I asked. They were very gracious about it. For $9? For considerably more than $9, Nora said, and Elspeth laughed, which was the first time Nora had heard her laugh, and it was a good laugh, complete and sudden and real. The bin stays, Nora continued. I'm not sure yet what it becomes. Maybe nothing. Maybe it just stands here, and people who know the story can come and look at it. Maybe that's enough. Elspeth put her own hand against the steel beside Nora's. Two women's hands on rusted corrugated iron in the Kansas April. My father would have liked you, Elspeth said. Nora thought about that. I think I would have liked him, she said. I think he and Raymond would have had a great deal to say to each other. About what? About stubbornness. About keeping secrets past the point where keeping them made sense. About what you do when you know what the right thing is and can't find the way to do it. She felt the familiar weight of Raymond's letter in her coat pocket. She had been carrying it since the day she found it. She did not take it out. She simply held her hand flat against the cold steel and let the hollow note of it move through her palm. Elspeth's hand was warm beside hers. They stood there for a moment that didn't need to be longer than it was. Then Nora said, Come back to the house. I'll make coffee, and there's a lemon cake Patricia sent from Wichita because she has started doing things like that, sending cake from Wichita, and I think we should take full advantage of it before she stops. Elspeth laughed again. The good laugh, the complete one. They walked back across the April field together, and behind them the bin stood in its ring of green trees in the afternoon light, and the weed on the surrounding land was exactly the green that Raymond had always pointed to with quiet satisfaction. The color of things that grow the way they're supposed to, that work the way they're supposed to, that keep the promises the season makes to the people who pay attention. In June, the Nora Calloway Transitions Program helped its first family. They were not from Harlan County. They were from a town called Elkhart in the southwestern corner of Kansas, close enough to Oklahoma that the county felt like a border country. The farm was 480 acres of dryland wheat ground, and the family was 3 generations. A grandmother who had lived there for 60 years, her son and daughter-in-law who had been farming it for 30, and their 2 daughters who were 17 and 19 and had been told for the past year that the farm would probably have to be sold because the operating debt was beyond what the revenue could sustain, and they couldn't figure out how to renegotiate the terms. The program's farm advisors spent 3 weeks with them. They found a refinancing structure the family hadn't known existed. They found a conservation easement arrangement that provided immediate cash while preserving the family's ability to continue farming. They found a federal program for which the farm was eligible, but which required paperwork so dense and specific that the family had applied once, made an error on page 11 of 40, received a rejection notice that explained nothing, and concluded the program wasn't available to them. The farm was not sold. The grandmother, whose name was Rosalie Hendricks and who was 81 years old and had the expression of a woman who has spent 6 decades watching the same sky and knows every mood it can produce, sent Nora a card that arrived on a Thursday afternoon at the extension office. The card was a plain one, the kind you buy in a drugstore. On the inside, in handwriting that was careful and slightly shaky with age, she had written, "Mrs. Calloway, I heard your story on the radio. I thought it was something that happened to other people. Then it helped us. Thank you for turning what you found into something that could reach us. Rosalie Hendricks." Nora read it at her desk in the extension office and held it for a long moment, and then did what she had been doing occasionally since October, the private thing that she did not call prayer and did not call anything in particular, but which involved being still and directing some interior attention towards somewhere she couldn't locate precisely. She thought, Raymond. The program helped its first family today. It worked the way we wanted it to work. She thought, this is what you left me. Not the bin, not the letter, not the instruction, but the accumulated weight of 33 years of watching you do the right thing imperfectly, which taught me what the right thing looked like and how to aim for it, even when you couldn't quite reach it. She thought, the $9 was yours. The rest of it I made of it. She put Rosalie Hendricks' card in the drawer where Raymond's letter lived. They sat together in the drawer, the old letter and the new card, which was not a strange place for them to be. The past and the present always lived in the same drawer. That was simply how time worked. August came, and with it a heat that settled over Harlan County with the serious intention of a season that knows its business. The wheat had been harvested on what used to be the Calloway farm, the first harvest under the new owners, and they had sent Nora a photograph of the combine working the field with the particular graciousness of people who understood that a field is always partly the people who farmed it before you, no matter how completely the papers say it's yours. She went out to the bin on a Sunday morning before the heat built. The elms were heavy and green, and the light was the low-angle gold of early August that made even rusted corrugated steel look like it was considering beauty. She stood in front of the door and put her hand on it the way she always did, the way she had done since October, the way she had done the first time in a gray October mist when she didn't know what she was looking for, only that there was something to look for. She opened the door, not for any practical reason, just to look inside. The interior was clean. The false floor was gone, the vault open and empty, lined with Walter Calloway's careful concrete. Priya Anand's team had removed the vault's contents with a thoroughness that had left the space almost surgical. But otherwise the bin was as it had always been, round and dim and smelling of old metal and dry air and the ghost of grain that had passed through it 50 years ago. She stood in the doorway and let the August morning air move past her into the interior. She thought about the things this space had held. Wheat, first, for years, then nothing, for decades. Then Hendrik Voss's 7 cases in their concrete vault, tended by the same stillness that tends all buried things. Then the brief, busy presence of attorneys and geologists and investigators, and the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and 2 women with claims that were both real and both partial and both, finally, honored. And now nothing again. The vault open and empty. The bin available for whatever came next. Some things, she thought, are not their contents. They are the fact of themselves. The bin was the bin. It had been worth $9 when she bought it, which was the price of the steel, the price of the salvage, the price of the physical and the obvious. What it was actually worth, what it had always been worth, was something else, something that couldn't be priced because it was made of time and trust and the specific human capacity for keeping things safe even when keeping them safe required a kind of courage that looked from the outside like stubbornness or secrecy or failure. Walter Calloway had kept something safe. He had failed to return it, which was a real failure, and Raymond had tried to correct the failure, and the correction had been incomplete, and Nora had finished it. 3 people and 62 years, and the thing was done now. The account was settled. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without grief on all sides, but settled in the way that matters, which is not the way where everything is made right. Some things cannot be made right, but the way where what can be done has been done, and what cannot be undone has been named and faced and held without pretending it isn't there. She stood in the doorway of the $9 bin for a long time. The August light came across the fields and the elms moved in the small wind that came up in the mornings before the heat settled. And somewhere on the road a truck went by, and far off a tractor was running, and the world went on doing what it does, which is continue, which is always continue, regardless of what is discovered or lost or buried or uncovered in the fields that make up any given ordinary life. She reached into her coat pocket and took out Raymond's letter. She unfolded it along its creases, the paper soft now from months of being carried. She read it one more time, the last line last. I loved you from the minute you laughed at my apology for stepping on your foot. I want you to know that. She did know. She had always known. She folded the letter back along its creases. She held it for a moment. And then, deliberately, she walked to the center of the bin and stood over Walter Calloway's open vault and held the letter over it and let it go. It was not a dramatic gesture. It landed in the bottom of the vault without ceremony. A small piece of cream-colored paper in the bottom of a concrete-lined hole in the floor of a rusted grain bin in the middle of a Kansas August. It lay there in the dim light looking exactly like what it was. A letter from a man who had loved her and trusted her and run out of time. She was not giving it away. She was putting it where it belonged. Back in the earth that had held the secret and released it. Back in the bin that had held the truth until the right person came. Back in the ground of the farm that had been theirs. The farm that was now someone else's, but was still in some irreducible way the place where 33 years of a life had taken shape. She would not need the letter anymore. She carried what it said in her body, in the work she was doing, in the fund named for Walter and Raymond, in the program named for herself, in the archive that held Hendrik Voss's careful handwriting, in Rosalie Hendrick's card in the drawer. She carried it in every emergency loan that moved fast enough to matter, in every farm family that got to keep what they had built, in every woman at 55 who would find herself in stockings in the mud someday, thinking she had no options and would learn that $9, spent on the right thing, can become something neither law nor price can fully contain. She walked out of the bin into the August morning. She did not look back. There was no need. The bin was not behind her. It was part of where she was going. The way all the places you have stood and all the things you have held and all the decisions you made before you knew what they meant become part of where you are going whether or not you can see them from where you stand now. She walked to her car and drove back toward town, toward the extension office where there was work to do, toward the phone she would answer when Patricia called at noon as she always did now, toward the life she had been building since October from the materials available, which had turned out, as the materials available always turn out, if you pay close enough attention, to be more than enough. The bin stood behind her in its ring of elms in the August light. The door was open. The vault was empty. The letter lay in the bottom of it, small and cream-colored and still. Above it, through the dented roof and the August sky and whatever comes after August in a particular life, the light kept doing what light does in Kansas, which is to spread across everything without distinguishing between what is worth $9 and what is worth 161 million, because the light, like the earth beneath the frost line, keeps no account of human assessments of value. It simply falls on everything. It always has. It always will. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.